Hello, and welcome to the Page to Pixel podcast. I am your host, Reid Jolan, and joined with me is Jeremy. Say hello, Jeremy.
Hi there.
So I'm not going to ask you how you're doing. What I'm going to actually ask you right off the bat is, why do Argonians have breasts?
Well, I have watched a 15-minute YouTube video about this in preparation for this episode, and there are three prevailing theories. So, either they hold breast milk, hissed sap, or just nothing. My prevailing theory that I'm going to agree with is that they're nothing, because apparently the hissed made them after an image of humans, so they probably just put them on because that's what female humans have. But I spent way too much time watching that video this morning, so that's about all I have to talk about there.
The best part of waking up is Argonians filling cups.
That's right.
That was perfect. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about the Elder Scrolls. So this is going to be a multiple part series. I'm not sure how many episodes we're going to have. I think we're planning on like 3 or 4. But we've kind of done smaller series in the past, like our last episode, Prince of Persia. Yeah, there's a lot of like this earlier games and stuff like that, but we talked about like the quadrilogy, and that's only 3 or 4 games. But when you're talking about something like the Elder Scrolls, which has a huge scope and scale of decades of time and information and, you know, just a lot of experiences over the last couple decades, there's obviously going to be a lot of time to kind of break down all the smaller details. And this is kind of a challenge that we wanted to do, to take on a bigger series now that we're into our second season. And that's what we're starting with is, the Elder Scrolls I know is very near and dear to a lot of people, myself and Jeremy included. So that's where we're kind of starting with today. So to kind of outline things for this first episode, we're kind of dubbing it the Origins episode. So in this episode, we're going to kind of talk about the mythology, the origins of the world of Elder Scrolls. We're going to talk a little bit about the races and locations of the Elder Scrolls. And then for this first episode, we are going to talk about the plot and just overall experiences with Arena, which is the first game, and then Daggerfall, which is the second Elder Scrolls game. So before we start doing that, maybe just we can talk really briefly about our gaming experiences with these 2 games. So if you guys aren't familiar with Arena and Daggerfall, which we are going to talk about, is the fact that they came out, I want to say Arena came out in March of 1994 on MS-DOS, yep, and Elder Scrolls Daggerfall came out in 96. So these games came out, within about 2 years of each other in the mid-90s. And were these games that you'd ever played before we started doing this, Jeremy?
Honestly, I can remember the first time I played Arena like it was a couple weeks ago.
Oh yeah? How was that?
Because it was a couple weeks ago.
Yep, same here.
Yeah, it's not fun.
No, it's very, very 1994, yes.
I made it out of the initial dungeon once, forgot to save because auto-saving isn't a thing in 1994, and have yet to remake it out of the dungeon. So it's a great experience.
Yeah, really good, really memorable. A lot of nostalgia for 2 weeks ago. Yeah, same thing for me, like Arena, Daggerfall. I kind of knew about the games, but my first game, Elder Scrolls, that I played was Morrowind. Back right around the time it came out, probably a little bit after, so I just knew it as Morrowind and Oblivion, but you see the Elder Scrolls in number 3, number 4, so obviously there are, predecessors. So I'd never played them. I'd never really paid much attention to it because I'm having too much fun with Morrowind or Oblivion. So I remember not too far after when Skyrim was originally released, they released an edition that had all of the games in it. And I almost bought it because it had all the disc versions of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I almost bought it, but what's nice about Arena and Daggerfall is that they are available on Steam for free, which is pretty good price.
A pretty good deal.
Pretty good deal. Granted, yeah, like Jeremy, I played Arena really briefly. It is very difficult to kind of go back to. I'm sure there's a modding community out there that has made it a bit better to play. I did play Daggerfall a bit. I did play Daggerfall Unity, to be more specific, which is this ongoing project that a lot of people are spending their time on, essentially rebuilding or remodifying Daggerfall in the Unity engine and adding a lot of mods and stuff like that. So I downloaded this mod package, and it really kind of changes a lot of the smaller and larger issues with Daggerfall. And I was playing that for a bit and I actually really enjoyed it. Yes, it's very janky still, but it does kind of really remind me a lot of Morrowind. So yeah, that's really our experiences with these games. Is we kind of knew about them a little bit, but in terms of like diving into it, this is the first time we've ever had the opportunity to. Do you want to talk a little bit more about your general impressions of these first two before we get into the lore here?
So what I noticed right away when I started Arena was it was very reminiscent of a game called Might and Magic 7 that I played a little bit growing up. Very D&D-esque. So it kind of just brought back some nostalgia of my, early teens, or late teens, I guess I should say. Very, very old school fantasy, and I don't know, I appreciate that art and style. When I was replaying Daggerfall, walking around the cities, some of the music that they had, even though it was probably 8-bit, not 16-bit, but it just had a very, really cool fantasy feel to it.
Yeah, it felt very 1980s Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that is, if you're a fan of D&D, it would probably stand out to you about these games is that the early history of Bethesda, to kind of talk about it just briefly, was founded by Chris Weaver, 1986, I believe. And they originally started off building physics engines for like sports games. Their first game was called Gridiron, and then they made a Wayne Gretzky hockey game. And then after that, they started doing a little bit more in-depth work. They did a adaptation of Terminator. And then what was nice about this whole process is that the team at Bethesda were able to kind of get together and have weekly D&D matches, or matches, I guess. matches. D&D plays, they'd be playing it together. So they were all kind of nerds in the fantasy sense. And I think a lot of that you can see as a major influence in especially the first two games. It's very much your prototypical sword and sorcery, elves and sorcery. And it's cool. It really is cool if that's your sort of thing. Yeah, that being said, let's see. Talking about Arena just a little bit, wasn't initially supposed to be this huge fantasy world. I don't know if you saw the same videos I did or read the same stuff that I did, but Arena was originally supposed to be just like a gladiator fighting game, where you would essentially kind of go from town to town with your troop of gladiators, essentially just fight. It would be, just simulating combat. But as they were building the game, it kind of they built more and more towns, and they built in more and more quests and stuff like that, and it became this full-fledged fantasy game. And one of the creators of Arena was like, okay, this game's getting a little bit beyond just the name Arena, right? Because you're not in an arena, you're in a huge world. So they stuck the name Elder Scrolls on it just as kind of like a vague placeholder in case, something kind of comes of this, and sure enough, it does. So I think that's kind of an interesting fun fact is like it was originally planned to be this just kind of brawler style game, and it kind of turned into a huger franchise, fantasy franchise, kind of by accident.
Yeah, I think I remember them, one of the docs saying that the side quests were more fun than the actual main quest of just going around fighting in different arenas, and that's kind of why they decided to switch it up.
Right, and they kept the name Arena because they had all the like printed materials and stuff already.
Right.
And they couldn't go back and redo all that.
They just retconned the reason why it was called Arena.
Yep, exactly. So looking at these games as a whole, I'm sure some of you probably played Skyrim, Oblivion. Hopefully some of you are old enough like us to play Morrowind. But these games are very much, I guess, a modern setting for fantasy that I think a lot of people are familiar with. I think a lot of people's, when they say fantasy video games, one of the first things they're probably going to think about is the Elder Scrolls. With this series, obviously, it's a huge, huge world. It's a lot bigger than I thought it was. In our initial research for doing this game, I didn't realize how much world building there was. And I think it's really cool. Like I've really enjoyed doing the research for this one because there's just so many cool things here. And we're kind of excited to kind of start talking about them. So unless you got any other segues, Jeremy, I will jump into like how this world was created.
I think the only other thing to mention that is how massive Daggerfall itself was.
Yes.
So it's a giant, not pre-generated, procedurally generated map over the entire continent of Tamriel, and it had yet to be surpassed in scale until No Man's Sky came out.
Yeah, which
is if you what's that 20, 30 years or 20, 25 years of of time frame in between those two games coming out.
Yeah, that is insane. And just like, I was playing it literally today, and I got out of the first dungeon, and you're in this like snowy mountain area, and you're like, oh, this is pretty cool. And then you look at your map, and it's just like, it's daunting. Even in 2022, it's really daunting. So, Daggerfall is historically known as one of the largest game worlds ever. And obviously with Oblivion and Skyrim, they're pretty decently sized. It's not anything to shake a stick at, but it's nowhere near as large as Daggerfall for sure. So, time for the mythology and the world building. So this is where it kind of divulges into Tolkien territory, I guess you could say.
Yeah. My eyes are just going to glaze over through this,
Yes.
so just keep going.
All right, and I'm going to try to break this down as easily as I could. I tried typing it down and copying some stuff down, and then I actually had to like physically write this down to make sense of it.
Ooh, gross.
I know. So there is the creation of everything, the universe that we're in. It begins with chaos, and there's nothing in the pre-universe, and from this sort of primordial nothingness, there are two forces that kind of come out of the void, forces of order and chaos, and these forces are called Anu and Padme. Yes, Padme. I don't know, man. Like, I'm reading this whole thing, and it's like Anu and
Is it
Padme.
actually Padme? I can remember the pronunciation.
Yeah,
again.
it's Podlmay. Padme. Yep. So there's these two orders. Okay, so out of this nothingness, you get order, which is represented by Anu, and you get chaos, which is represented by Padme. What they do is this general idea of order and chaos comes their own souls. They become sort of sentient, and they birth their own souls. Anu El and Sithis. So Anu El is the spirit of Anu, and Sithis doesn't keep with the name, but is the spirit or soul of Padme. So I think that's kind of interesting because it kind of sounds like Padme, and she gives birth to her own self, which is Sith. Anyway, so what happens?
Do you think Skywalker was a big
I don't know.
George Lucas?
I don't know, man. You gotta read between the lines for yourselves, man.
It's just the Illuminati controlling everything.
So what essentially happens is Anu and Padme, they kind of diverge into each other, and because of the pressure of chaos and the pressure of order, what is born is the universe called Arbis. Aurbis. Arbis. And that is essentially the universe. So out of order and chaos comes the universe Orbis. Within Orbis, so you have Mundus, which is the, I guess you would call that the mortal plane of existence, where you have the planets and you have, the timeline and stuff like that. You have Oblivion, which of course is really important for the Oblivion game, which we'll talk about a few episodes down the road. You have Aetherius, which is the immortal, the plane of the gods. So if you remember, I believe, what is it, Sovngarde in Skyrim? Where it's like that, yeah, that's a part.
Valhalla, basically.
Well, that part of Aetherius is essentially the immortal plane, and then another part of Arbis is the void, which, as you can imagine, there's not a whole lot going on there. So, after Orbis is created, things begin to form out of the void. The first things that kind of come out of this void are Auriel and Lorcan. They are essentially souls birthed out of Anu-El and Sithis. Okay? So let's recap what I just said over the last few minutes. Order and chaos, Anu and Padme, they diverge together, and they create the universe. But they also create their own souls of Anu-El and Sithis. Anu-El and Sithis create Aruel and Lorcan. Okay? We're still on the same page. So these Aruel, the essential granddaughter spirit of the original idea of order, creates what we consider time. With time being a thing within the universe that essentially generates chaos, and it generates the locomotion of the universe. And out of that, what are called et-adas, E-T'-ADA, they essentially are what we would consider like the high primordial spirits. So they're essentially like the, I don't know, call them necessarily proto-gods, but that's essentially what they kind of become, is et-ada is the original spirits. Okay? Still with me, everybody?
No.
So, yes, these gods, Anu and Padme, they create their own spirit, and they, out of all of this chaos, they create the universe, And within this, they also create the first order of gods. The Et Ada is what they're called. Okay? So this is where a lot of the creative forces kind of come into play. What happens is Anu and Padme are constantly struggling with each other. Again, it's order and chaos, right? So they create a number of different planes, like I just mentioned. They create Mundus, which is the universe. Not the universe, it's the plane of existence that, the orcs and the elves are all on. It also creates Oblivion. It creates Aetherius and the Void. But not all of the planes of existence were, stable or content. There was one Et Ada, one primal spirit called Lorcan, who was created by the spirit of Sithis, which again is the primordial being of Padme. And what Lorcan wants to do is he goes to the other Et Ada and he kind of says, you know what, I kind of want to create my own thing. Will you guys help me? And they say, sure. Some of them say, sure, why not? So what happens is Lorcan either tricks or convinces some of the other gods to create Mundus, which is the plane of existence that you are familiar with. It's the normal, the planets and stuff like that, Tamriel, it's all that stuff. And because of the effort it takes to create Mundus, a lot of the gods and stuff lose their power. So what Lorcan does is he creates the mortal plane. They become what is known as the Aedra. So the people that were creating Mundus become the Aedra, while some of the other primal spirits, the Et Ada, become the Daedra. They decide not to help them out, and they develop their own plane of existence called Oblivion. So you kind of see here, so let's take a step back here. So these gods are all kind of gathering together, and they're kind of getting a little bored, they're getting a little discontent, and Lorcan says to them, hey, let's create our own thing where we can kind of put our own energies into. And a bunch of the gods agree, and they do, and they create this universe, this plane of existence. But some of the gods disagree, and they create their own stuff, where they're not putting in as much energy and kind of, essentially killing themselves in a way. But what happens is you get the normal plane of existence, Mundus, and then you get Daedra. And if you've played Oblivion, you know what a Daedra is. It's this other plane of existence. If you remember Oblivion, they open the gates between the two realities, essentially. So as I was just saying, the Aedra gods essentially create the mortal plane. But what happens is they realize that they're giving up parts of their being, and they're essentially drained to a lower status. But the creation of the creation of the other plane of existence that the Daedra are responsible for doesn't drain them as much. So that's why you sort of see how, if you're familiar with Oblivion, I'm sure you remember going into the Oblivion gates, how everything just looks kind of twisted but somewhat similar. It's because, just imagine as if God had a plan for what they wanted Earth to look like, but, Lucifer had his planet and he did whatever he wanted with it. It's kind of like that. It's kind of evolved on its own terms depending on, the background there. So a lot of the gods departed the mortal plane of Mundus before it was complete. Chief among these was Magnus, the architect of Lorcan's plan. So Magnus is really important because he's essentially the creator of magic in the world of Elder Scrolls. He's more or less the one that bestows the magical ability within Mundus. So his departure actually opens a hole in the barrier between the planes of existence, allowing magic to kind of come into the mortal plane of Mundus. Not all of the gods decide to leave Mundus. They don't decide to leave our plane of existence. But what actually happens is those gods that decide to stay become the 8 divines. Now are you kind of catching up with it, Jeremy? You remember those names? So a lot of the these gods that decide to stay in Mundus, they become the gods and patrons of the inhabitants of this realm of existence. So yeah, we have the 8 divines that are essentially staying to kind of protect and be patrons of Mundus. And during this whole process, Lorcan's heart is removed and made into a magical stone, which does actually have some plot points in different games. So looking at all of the other details here, and this is what's considered the Dawn era. So there's different eras within the Elder Scrolls, and we're going to talk about those in a few minutes. But as with any creation story, since these are gods of infinite power and capabilities, anytime where there's a body part removed, it's larger than, our own body part and stuff like that. So what essentially happens at the end of this era, Lorcan is kind of bound to his creation. and his heart is ripped out and cast down into Tamriel, which is the main continent that all the games take place on. And his heart allegedly becomes Vardenfell, which is the Red Mountain volcano, which is the home of the Dark Elves. And it's there where his kind of heart remains dormant. After all the other gods sort of leave the planet, the main planet of Nirn, what happens is time kind of allows things to sort of stabilize, and that's where you start to see some of the earlier races and stuff like that. Okay.
While you're recapping that, did you find that same information potentially Lorkhan was using the idea of creation to trick the other gods into being less powerful?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I kind of ran across when I was doing this is like it depends on what source you look at within the game. So that's the biggest thing. So jumping back to the Daedra really quick, as I kind of mentioned before, some of the Et Ada, which are like the main primal gods, they didn't want to give up their spirit, and they wanted to kind of focus more on Oblivion, which is the other realm of existence. They didn't really care about the mortal plane, so they really put a lot of their effort into Oblivion and the other Daedric realms, which would become. So to break everything down here, let's just kind of do this. So if you're really confused, you can just kind of focus on this part. So to recap everything, there are two forces at the beginning of everything, order and chaos. Out of that order and chaos, they essentially birth themselves, and because of their relationship, there's different things that are kind of born from that, including the different realms of existence. And also out of this comes different gods, the Et Ada. The Et Ada are the primal forces that kind of dictate a lot of things. And some of the Et Ada decide to give up some of their power to create the mortal plane of existence. The other ones that did not do that become the Daedra. They kind of focus more on Oblivion. The Et Ada, who did actually give their force to create the world, became the Aedra. So the Aedra versus the Daedra, right? So that's where you can kind of see the name coming here. And the Aedra that did actually contribute to the creation of the mortal plane of existence, Mundus, became the 8 divine, or 9 divine, depending on what time of the story that you're kind of talking about. But just as a recap, for those people that have played the game, here are those 8 or 9 divine. There's Akatosh, who is the dragon god of time and chief god of the pantheon. So you can kind of think of the 8 divine, the 9 divine as kind of like the Olympians. But Akatosh, yes, the dragon god. You have Arche, who is the god of cycle of life and death, mortals, burials, funeral rites. There's Dibella, the goddess of beauty and love. Julianos is the god of wisdom and logic. Canerith, who is the goddess of air, wind, sky, and the elements. Mara is the goddess of love. If you ever did any of the marriage side quests in Skyrim, you did some of the quests of Mara. Stendar is the god of compassion, mercy, justice, charity, luck, righteous rule, and merciful forbearance. Talos is the hero god of mankind. He is the conqueror god. He's kind of like the Thor. Talos is the Thor. And then there's Zenithar, who's the god of work and commerce and also considered a trader god. So Akatosh, Arche, Dibella, Julianos, Kinnerith, Mara, Stendar, Talos, Zenithar are the 9 divine. I believe it is Talos who's the one that's kind of iffy, because some people don't consider that Talos is actually a true 9 divine, that it's called the 8 and 1. But if you've played through Skyrim, you've seen different statues to the 9 divine or the 8 divine. In terms of your interactions within the games, you're typically interacting with the 8 divines, who again are the gods that decided to help out and create this plane of existence. Whew, that is a lot of talking, man.
Yeah, I agree. So they actually stayed in Mundus and left the planet, and they are the reasons the other planets are in the sky, correct?
Correct.
So that also kind of even mirrors how some of the ancient civilizations of Earth also looked at some of the foreign celestial bodies as deities.
Right, and I believe that the moon is like the body of Lorkhan's corpse. Lorkhan's corpse. So like
yes.
the planets
and that plays very heavily into the Khajiit culture.
Yep. So the planets of Sakuda and Masur, which orbit the planet of Nirn, they are Lorkhan's corpse. So yeah, you do see this a lot of times, and like it's interesting that they built this mythology, which is very unique in itself, but is very like I can see connections with ancient like Mesopotamians and Egyptians and stuff like that. So it's really really cool. Obviously, there's a lot more to this, of course. but this is really the extent of what we can do within a podcast's kind of timeline here.
Yeah, not really a visual medium, so not conducive
Yeah,
to
it really
something
is.
this in depth.
And my research is really kind of a combination of watching videos on YouTube, going on different wikis and stuff like that for all of this information. So
You're not playing through the games and reading all the books?
no,
What a
unfortunately,
sellout.
I know. Unfortunately, I'm not. But I guess the biggest thing to kind of remember when looking at the gods, what's really important is the 8 divines, the 9 divines, and I guess the Daedra, which do kind of come up quite a few times, especially in the more modern Elder Scrolls games. So unless you had anything else to say about the mythology and world building?
I guess I have one question, and maybe this is just kind of a personal opinion. So, are the Daedra technically what you would consider evil, or are they just kind of made up of chaotic energy? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think they're more akin to chaos. I don't think if they're
not necessarily. It's not necessarily a good versus evil, but more like what their essence causes them to maybe hurt your standard folk more than the Aedra would.
So yeah, with the Daedra, I think they're just more akin to the natural tendencies of chaos and darker side of things. It's like, I don't know, it's like being on Earth and then your neighbor is kind of closer to the sun, so they're naturally going to have a different disposition. Kind of think of it like that. The Daedra, who are on a different plane of existence, they're to themselves aren't going to seem evil, but maybe to us they would. And there's, instead of the 8 divines or 9 divines like we have of the Daedra have the Daedric princes. Like, I'm sure you know Merus Dagon, Molag Bal, Sheogorath. I mean, all the amazing, fun gods that you kind of interact with sometimes in the Elder Scrolls games are all Daedric princes. So the Daedra or Daedroth, when looking at defining, like, okay, are they on the same level as the 8 divine or 9 divine? It's really hard to say. There's not a huge consensus on if they're on the same level as Akatosh or Dibella or anybody else. But my general understanding is that they're pretty powerful. You know, a lot of these creatures or princes are pretty well feared within Tamriel. Like Merus Dagon, there's Molag Bal, there's Sheogorath has a bunch of different quest lines and stuff like that. So I don't think they're necessarily on the same level as the 8 divine because, of course, the divine Aedra, they gave up their power to kind of create the mortal plane of existence. But I'm essentially guessing that the Daedra had to do a very similar thing. And as
maybe like high-ranking demons in like the Christian myth.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's not
so like not just your run-of-the-mill like crossroads demon, but something like a Baal or
right, and
you know, that kind of thing.
Right, and I think with obviously as the plot goes, they're always thwarted, right? They're always banished or whatever else to their realm again. So maybe they aren't necessarily as powerful. And of course, in the ending of Oblivion, that's when what's the name of the Sean Bean character in Oblivion? God, what's his name?
Uriel Septim's like bastard son.
Yeah, the prince, right? He turns into Akatosh and he fights in the Imperial City. He fights, was it Merus Dagon, and wins. So it kind of could be a chess match or a tug of war, but I think typically the Aedra kind of win out. I don't know if it's because they have the power of good on their side or what it is, but that's a lot of conversations about gods and stuff like that. But if you're familiar with the game, looking at other Daedra, like the Atronachs, where it's like the flame summons and the frost summons, that's all Daedric stuff. So like neuromancers and conjurers, they're able to kind of conjure lesser Daedra. So it's kind of a cool thing the more you think about it, because when you're playing the game, it's one thing. But when you actually look at like how you're able to do that and how it's crossing this plane of existence, that's pretty cool to think about.
His name is Martin.
Martin, yes. Martin Septim. What? Where's the necklace? Yeah. So, yes, Martin, who turns into Akatosh and fights Dagon. Not to be confused with Dagon from the Cthulhu mythos, but here we are. Oh, we have friends, I swear. Okay, so looking at we don't. But the next step here, that's really all the mythology and origins. Apologies that it's a little scatterbrained, but as you can imagine, there's a lot to kind of digest with this. It's really cool, I think, overall. Like I said, with the idea of the convergence of the Daedra and the Aedra with our realm of existence and their realm of existence, it is kind of a cool concept. But unless there's any further things to talk about, I can jump into the eras really briefly. I'm not going to belabor the point here.
No, go for it.
All right, cool. So we have the Dawn Era. This is really what I was just talking about. This is the origin of everything. So the Dawn Era is an era in which time began and the world was created. It was a time of chaos and magic where gods walked in Nirn, which is the planet. Elven history, and what's interesting about the elves is they sort of trace their ancestries to the first mortal beings. So the elves essentially have a chip on their shoulder, especially the high elves, thinking that they are the supreme beings because they're the first people to kind of come of the world. So elven history begins after the cosmos stabilizes, when Magnus, who I mentioned before, sort of leaves Nirn and kind of breaks that wall between magic. And Lorkhan is condemned for the creation of the mortal plane. It begins with the emergence of Anu and Padme and ends with the convention. Okay, so that's the first era. That is the Dawn Era. Then there is the Merithic Era. Merithic. So the Merithic Era is the era that begins when a linear timeline can be discerned. This era begins in ME 2500. So instead of having BC or 80, they have ME. So the earliest date to be recorded by King Harold Scribe and goes backwards to 1E, which is the first year of the first era. So some notable events that happened in the Merithic era include the construction of the Adamantine Tower in 2500 ME, the exodus of the Aldemari people from their ancestral homelands of the Aldemaris, and the settling of the vast coasts of Tamriel, and the later the exodus of the Atmorans from the continent of Atmora, the ancestors of the Nords, who begin settling the northern coasts of Tamriel. So Atmora is essentially kind of like the Iceland to Tamriel. It's in like the northern reaches. The era ends with the founding of the Comoran dynasty in Valenwood. And Valenwood is the land of the Wood Elves, correct?
Correct.
All right, I'm still on a roll. All right, first era. So after that era is the first era, even though it's the third in the timeline. The first era is a very long era that lasts for about 3,000 years and is marked by a visible shift in the power between the elven and human races. So in the last era, you kind of see the elves kind of being the prominent one, but because of the divergence of populations, humans are starting to establish themselves kind of all throughout the planet. So, with the success of the Elysian Rebellion and shattering of the Alien Empire, the first era begins when Remen Cyrodiil III, so there's the name of the imperial capital area, I believe, and his heir Juliac are assassinated, ending the Remen line of Cyrodiilic emperors, and the Sese Potente Versude Shai takes the throne. Easy to say, kids. I didn't have to try that 4 times. The most notable events of the first era include the formation of the First Orsinium, which is the essentially the kingdom of the orcs, I believe.
Yes.
The first kingdom of Skyrim, the first empire of the Nords, and the first empire of man led by Saint Alicia. So this is really when you start to see, to kind of recap the first era, is when you start to see the establishment of certain political entities, the races kind of establishing themselves. So that's the first era. So the second era lasts for about 900 years, beginning with the death of the Remen dynasty at the hands of Morang Tong, and ending with Tiber Septim's harnessing of the Numidium and bringing peace to Tamriel. We're going to talk about the Numidium once we get to Daggerfall. The more notable events of the second era include the assassination of that person, Potente Versidue Shai, and his later son, Savrian Shorak, and all his heirs, ending the Second Empire of Men and causing the Interregnum. This period was also marked by the Three Banners War between the Ebonheart Pact, Daggerfall Covenant, and the First Aldemari Dominion over the Ruby Throne, which, if you are familiar with the Elder Scrolls Online, is basically the major factions in that game. So this is actually when the second era is when Elder Scrolls Online takes place. So after the Aldemari Dominion and Daggerfall Covenant and Ebonheart Pact are fighting for the Ruby Throne, the Elven Necromancer Manny Marco ruled the Empire and worked with the Daedric prince Molag Bal, who wishes to drag the mortal plane into oblivion, Cold Harbor. It's interesting to see this interaction between the Mundus, the normal plane of existence, and the other planes of existence, including Oblivion. So that's the second era, and again, this is around the time of Elder Scrolls Online. Okay, 2 more to go. Third era. The third era was a rather short era that only lasted about 433 years, and this is where the first 4 Elder Scrolls games takes place. So the third era is where Arena takes place, Daggerfall takes place, Morrowind takes place, and Oblivion take place. So this is the era where Tiber Septim So if you've played the games before, you know the name Tiber Septim. He unites all of Tamriel under the banner of the Empire, and the Septim dynasty begins. Since the beginning of the Third Empire of Men, there have been many civil wars and revolts against the Empire's rule. Notable events of the Third Era include the Nevereen's victory over Daggerfall and the Akulakan, which is, I believe, what happens during Morrowind, the Second Eruption at Red Mountain, and the assassination of Uriel Septim VII, which is the beginning of Oblivion, which does, of course, lead to the Oblivion Crisis. Martin Septim sacrifices himself. We talked about that before. He becomes the avatar of Akatosh, and sacrifices him during the Oblivion Crisis, which kind of marks the end of the Septim bloodline and also the end of the Third Era. So all of the events that we just mentioned, the Nevereen, which is the name of the main character in Morrowind, you see the events of Oblivion take place, and as the end of Oblivion kind of leads to the Fourth Era, which I'll talk about right now. So the Fourth Era begins once Martin dies, the Septim bloodline, it kind of shrivels up, and it marks the rise of the Thalmor. So if you played Skyrim, you're pretty familiar with the Thalmor, and the establishment and rise of the Third Aldmeri Dominion, as well as the Great War within the Third Empire. The last known year of the Fourth Era is 4E201, the year in which the Dragon Crisis occurs and the last Dragonborn rose to combat the World Eater Alduin. So this is where you see Skyrim, essentially, right? So I knew this playing Skyrim, that it did take place a couple hundred years after Oblivion and Morrowind. The first 4 Elder Scrolls game take place in a period of about 400 or so years, and then about 400 years after that era is the era of Skyrim. So that, again, is just a really brief summary. There's a lot of stuff in there that we're probably going to flesh out as we talk about these individual games. But a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today is really going to be centered in that Third Era period. So, anything else to say before we kind of jump into the first game in this collection, which is Arena, Jeremy?
Yeah, are we going to talk about how the races settled the Tamriel?
Oh, yeah, we should talk about the races and the... should.
Let's talk about races.
Let's talk about race. Not enough people do that enough.
So before any of the elves or humans came to Tamriel, there were 2 of the playable races that we know that are native to Tamriel. You have the Khajiit and the Argonians. The Khajiit are a cat-like folk. Interesting enough, were you aware of this, Reid? But what type of Khajiit you are is based on the lunar cycle of the moons at the time of your birth.
Yeah, I was listening to one of the Elder Scrolls podcasts, and they were talking about how the Khajiit have like a ruler depending on the cycle of the moon. Everything's related to the moon, which is really cool, and they think that everyone's favorite commodity in Morrowind, moon sugar, is like the essence of the actual moon. It's so cool.
Right. So you could be born from a tiny little ocelot to an actual bipedal, normal humanoid-looking Khajiit that everyone knows and loves today. Mm-hmm. Just an interesting tidbit. And then the Argonians are from the Black Marsh area. They were made by the Hist, which basically took the reptiles of the area and converted them into their bipedal humanoid figures.
Were the Hist like a natural force? Were they wizards? What are the Hist?
Hist are sentient trees, so they would also kind of technically be considered a race native to Tamriel.
So they're swamp ents, is what you're saying.
Essentially, yeah. And then the Hist basically use the Argonians to kind of protect them, and their society and religion is basically purely formed around the Hist.
Got it.
So from there, the only other races, there is I forgot what they're called, but it's like a Sasquatch race and a fox-like race that's believed to be extinct, and then things like goblins, ogres, the sort of beastmen, if you will. So the first non-native races known to settle Tamriel, as you mentioned before, were the elves. They first settled in the Somerset Isles. From there, they began to slowly kind of expand the areas around. They went to Valenwood, which would eventually become the High Elves, and then Cyrodiil, which would be the Aelids. And they ruled Cyrodiil for a while until there was a human slave uprising, which kind of overthrew and just destroyed their civilization, and any remaining one of the Aelids would have went back and just kind of dissolved into the other elven races. And that's why when you're playing Oblivion, all those Aeliad ruins are essentially from those people.
So this would be around the time of the first era.
The first age. Yep, correct.
Cool.
So, all of those other elves that left were kind of a part of that initial Aldmer organization or faction. So that expansion was kind of chill with them. However, when what would become the Dark Elves left for Morrowind, they left with the prophet Veloth, and that was against the wishes of the other Aldmer, and one in particular, one of the original spirits, Trinimac, took some of his followers out to basically hunt them down and stop them. While this was happening, Veloth was eaten and corrupted by a Daedric prince known as Beothan. So I'm not sure if he was actually physically eaten or if that was just kind of being poetic, but he was then corrupted and became Malakath, whose original followers then become the Orc race of the Elder Scrolls.
Oh.
So the Orcs are actually corrupted elves, kind of very Tolkien-esque with the Uruk-hai.
Yeah, very much so.
When the soon-to-be Dark Elves go to Morrowind, they meet the Dwemer, and they're basically already there. So there is a little kind of either false information or not well-cited sources, because there's also currently snow elves up in Skyrim. My personal theory is that at some point, instead of settling Somerset Isles, the elves that were coming from wherever they were before, if you believe that their homeland of Aldmeris was actually in Atlantis and sunk into the ocean, or if they just came from somewhere else. But they at some point either diverged off and settled those areas and were never a part of that original settlement in Somerset Isle, or they may also just be native elves to Tamriel. There's not really any good sources there. The first humans to then settle the area would be the Needs. They were a very primitive race. They were said to be pre-literate, so I'm not sure how they passed through the ocean being pre-literate, but they began to settle in High Rock, Skyrim, Cyrodiil, and Morrowind, and they were generally persecuted, especially by the elves. The Aelids enslaved essentially any of them that came into Cyrodiil, until the Atmorans came. So they would be the human race from the north, sort of what we would think of as, air quotes, Vikings, right? And initially they had an alliance with the Snow Elves already living in Skyrim. However, the Snow Elves became afraid of them because of how fast they began to populate that area, and the Elves betrayed the Atmorans, sacking their city of Sarathal. They slaughtered everyone in the city in an event that would be known as the Night of Tears. The only survivors of the Night of Tears, Ysigramir and his sons Yengothal and Yiglar, returned to Atmora, where they would gather an army known as the 500 Companions, returning to defeat the Snow Elves, driving them underground where they would be enslaved by the Dwemer.
Wait, isn't the Snow Elves, isn't that the
Falmor? Yes, they become the Falmor. So they are enslaved by the Dwemer until the Dwemer disappear.
And I'm not sure if you want to get stand underground because they're like blind and everything, right?
Yes, yeah. Well, essentially their civilization was shattered into nothing. So
and they all become Gollum, essentially.
Essentially, yes. But yes, and then when the Dwemer just disappear, they basically just keep hanging out underground.
Okay. So
once the Atmorans defeat the Snow Elves, they will continue to settle through Tamriel, but essentially they just kind of integrated and regionally kind of and culturally just kind of came into their own social cultures and standards. So obviously the ones that stayed in Skyrim, the Atmorans and the Needs kind of just became the Nords. In Cyrodiil, the Atmorans were then also enslaved, and the two Need and Atmoran enslaved groups would eventually break their bonds of slavery and become the Imperials. High Rock, the Atmoran, Needs, and the Aldmer population, that culture just kind of blurred into one race of people, the Bretons. And the only ones that were not of that initial stock would be the Red Guards, who fled their homeland of Yakuta, which was an island that was actually sinking into the sea. And they landed off the coast of Tamriel on an island called Herne, and they slowly began to move inward into Hammerfell and just kind of have been a very secluded culture. They began to trade a little bit with some of the other, I believe it was in High Rock, but they've always been just kind of more recluse until they became under the might of the Empire.
Right. And going back to what you said about the Bretons, I didn't know this until like I started doing research for this, is that the Bretons they're kind of like Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, because he's kind of like partially elf.
Yeah, half elf.
Yeah. So they're kind of like the traditional half. I didn't know that. I always thought they were just humans. Yeah.
It explains their like that they're humans with a natural affinity towards magic and a natural resistance to it, because in a lot of fantasy, elves are always naturally resistant to magic and stuff like that. So
yeah, the Bretons are essentially the half elves of this series. Ish.
I would say it's probably closer to like how every white person is 1/16 Cherokee.
I suppose. Yeah, on my mom's side. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so did you cover all of them then?
Yeah, basically. The only ones I didn't go into depth with was the disappearance of the Dwemer, but I think that's probably something we'll want to cover more in depth on a later episode.
Right.
Because that'll probably be maybe like a Morrowind episode, because that's heavily to do with the Dark Elves.
Right, and I don't want to get too much into it, but my assumption is that the Dwemer are kind of like dwarves.
They are actually elves.
Okay.
Yeah, they are the dwarves of the Elder Scrolls, but they are still an elven race. They're just like an underground, like techie steampunk elf, if you will.
Steampunk elf. Sounds good. So I'm just gonna recap this real quickly, because Jeremy did a great job with the history here. But if you're ever playing any of these Elder Scrolls games, you have the option of choosing 9 different races, 10 different races. And just going to break it all down, looking at the map of Tamriel, in the middle you have Cyrodiil, which is home of the Imperials. To the south of that you have Elsewhere, which is the home of the Khajiit. To the west of Elsewhere you have Valenwood, which is the home of the Wood Elves, or the Bosmer. To the east of Elsewhere you have Blackmarsh, which is the home of the Hist and the Argonians. To the north of the Blackmarsh you have Morrowind, or Vardenfell, which is the home of... Morrowind's like the actual land. Vardenfell's the island of Morrowind, yes. Correct? Okay. Which is the home of the Dark Elves, or the Dunmer. To the northwest of Morrowind, you have Skyrim, which is home of the Nords. The orcs, as you kind of mentioned, they live southwest of Skyrim in Hammerfell. They're kind of scattered all throughout the kingdom, though.
Yeah, they're very tribal and really scattered. For a while, they had their city. You mentioned it earlier.
Orsinium,
yeah, but I believe that ends up falling, and they kind of scatter a little bit more, if I remember correctly.
Yep. So in Hammerfell is the orcs, largely, and of course the Redguards. And to the north of Hammerfell you have High Rock, which is the home of the Bretons. And then in the southwestern portion of Tamriel, on an island with boats and jet skis, you have the High Elves. And what's interesting, I didn't really kind of make the correlation until I did this research, of course, is that all of the elves have the... suffix of mer. Right, Merca. So the High Elves are called the Altmer, right? Altmer. Mm-hmm. The Dunmer, which is the Dark Elves, and then you have the Bosmer. So all of those elven names end with mer. So I think that's kind of an interesting fact that all kind of diverge into their own categories there. But talking about races, of course, is a very fun and non-controversial subject. But trying to be as fun as we can, whenever you're making a character in any of the Elder Scrolls games, what 3 races do you typically choose?
Khajiit.
Khajiit for one. Okay, what are the other 2?
Argonian.
Okay.
I don't know. Like, those are usually my 2 go-tos, like, if I'm playing my typical, like, stealthy sneak guy.
Okay.
I guess probably Nord because of Skyrim.
Yeah, I mean, my major character, of course, because you want to play along the storyline of Skyrim, which is largely based on the Nordic kingdoms versus the Imperial presence and stuff like that. For me, it was always, it was really dependent largely on which game I was playing, but I kind of always find myself making either a Dark Elf, Nord, or Breton. I always had affinity for Bretons for some reason.
Into the Bretons.
And that is, I believe, where the projection for Elder Scrolls 6 is going to take place. Oh. It's either Hammerfell or High Rock. My money, honestly, like, this is probably too far of a shot, but my idea for Elder Scrolls 6 is why it's taking so long, is it's going to be every continent. Or every
province?
Every province, yes.
Bring it back to the arena in Daggerfall? That'd be awesome.
Well, I mean, Elder Scrolls Online kind of does it anyway already.
Right.
You can travel to a lot of these different locations, and even within Skyrim, you can travel back to Solstheim, which is one of the northern islands above Vardenfell. So, and elsewhere, they have elsewhere in Elder Scrolls Online, and I'm sure some of these other places too. Yeah. Somerset Isles, I know you can go to as well. So, like, yeah, why not make it such a massive? Awesome. It's going to be 300 gigabytes.
Gigs.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be 300. It's going to be your entire hard drive anyway. So who cares?
17 Blu-ray discs.
Yes, I hope so. 85 CDs. I think all the races are pretty cool on their own merit.
I always had a hard time playing elves, especially in Oblivion, just because they look so freaking goofy.
Well, yeah, we don't talk about... I think the only race in Oblivion that looks somewhat decent is the orcs. Yeah. And they look like Shrek. They all look like
Shrek.
I mean, they all look like they're bobbleheads. They all look, really stupid, but... That's neither here nor there. We're of course going to talk about that as we get into Oblivion. But since it's been about an hour of us talking about background, maybe we should actually kind of jump into the games themselves, unless we have any other comments about.
No.
And of course, looking at the map of Tamriel, all of these places, they have very different climate and geography. Cyrodiil, which is the place where that the game Oblivion takes place, is your really idyllic European, farms and mountains and pretty waterways, rivers, stuff like that. Morrowind, which I think is so unique in a lot of ways because of its geography. We'll talk. I'm not gonna talk about it today, but all of these different places, they have similar geography in some regards, but a lot of them have their own very unique characteristics. Like Hammerfell is largely very deserty. Somerset Isles is apparently very tropical. Not tropical, but very beautiful. Maybe it is tropical. Valenwood is, as you can imagine with the name, very, very wooded. Elsewhere is like jungly, right?
So it is like a sandy desert and half kind of jungly, yep.
Okay. And Black Marsh
has faction lines between the Khajiit based on their geography.
Oh. And Black Marsh is, I'm guessing, pretty swampy.
Yeah, it's you after you've been working for like 10 hours.
Yeah, okay. And Skyrim, of course, you guys know what Skyrim is. It's pretty mountainous. High Rock, I don't know much about High Rock. Is that more like, I'm thinking like France, Spain, kind of? Because it's pretty far northern, so I'm guessing it would be pretty different depending on... Because Daggerfall...
I don't know.
Because that's where Daggerfall is. So we're going to talk about Daggerfall in a few minutes here. But Daggerfall is actually kind of it's a city in the south of High Rock. And that's kind of an important city for the ongoing political conflict that I'm going to talk about.
It looks kind of similar to Cyrodiil. I would say diverse. A very diverse,
biomes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that is that's the world of Tamriel, which is the main... There's other continents, but you don't play there. You don't really do much with them. It's just kind of like... It's kind of like in Game of Thrones where you have Westeros, and then Essos. And how Essos is there, but there's not a ton of... I mean, there's some of the stuff going on,
but no one cares.
Right. And then that's basically how we're going to kind of view this. We're going to really base a lot of our stuff moving forward based upon these places in Tamriel. That's where the majority of these games take place. So, that being said, are you ready to start with Arena, my good boy?
Oh, I'm ready to roll.
All right, I'll let Jeremy tell us a bit about Elder Scrolls 1 Arena. Came out in March of 1994. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Elder Scrolls Arena takes place in the 389th year of the Third Age in Tamriel, a land so war-torn the citizens have dubbed it the Arena. The ruler, Emperor Uriel Septim VII, has been betrayed by his advisor and Imperial battle mage, Yeagar Tharn. Using a magical artifact known as the Staff of Chaos, Yeagar has banished the Emperor into a foreign dimension. Now Yeagar sits upon the throne of the Imperial Palace, magically disguised as the Emperor with a retinue of demonic forces, enchanted to appear as Imperial guards. The only witness is Yeagar's apprentice, Rhea Silmain, who has been killed before she can inform the Elder Council of Yeagar's treachery. Fortunately, Rhea's magic allows her to take an incorporeal form. Rhea reaches out to an unlikely champion deep in the bowels of the Imperial dungeon. A prisoner is contacted by a magical visage. Rhea tasks the champion with collecting the pieces of the staff, which have been broken and scattered across Tamriel. The champion escapes the dungeon with Rhea's aid through a magical portal. Far away from the Imperial city, the champion is safe to recuperate. Rhea appears again in the champion's dreams, telling him where the staff pieces can be found. The hero begins their search in the province of Hammerfall. Finally, in the depths of Fang Lair, the first staff piece is found. An image of Yagar appears to the champion, saying, "Give up the staff, and your death will be painless." When the champion declines the offer, demons appear and attack the champion. With the demons slain, the champion is free to continue their quest, finding pieces in the Labyrinthina in Skyrim, Elden Grove in Valenwood, the Halls of the Colossus and elsewhere, Crystal Tower in the Somerset Isles, Crypt of Hearts in High Rock, Mirkwood in Blackmarsh, and Doggoth Ur in Morrowind. With the staff whole again, Rhea appears to the champion with her final task. The Jewel of Fire in the Imperial Palace has been imbued with the power of the Staff of Chaos. It holds Yagar's life force and the ability to free the Emperor from his dimensional prison. Rhea uses the last of her power to magically disguise the champion, allowing them to sneak past the guards of the Imperial Palace. The champion sneaks past the palace guards, though in the heart of the palace, Yagar's minions are not fooled by the illusion, forcing the champion to fight their way to Yagar. Trapped in the palace, Yagar is forced to fight the champion. While critically wounded, Yagar erects a magical force field. The champion takes advantage of the opening and slams the Staff of Chaos into the Jewel of Fire. Yagar looks on in horror, realizing his mistake, shouting, "You must not! That jewel holds my life force!" Yagar melts away as the staff opens a portal, freeing the Emperor and an Imperial Guard. The Emperor thanks the champion and dubs them the Eternal Champion. Thus concludes the events of Elder Scrolls Arena.
You know what that plot reminds me of?
Literally the first D&D campaign anyone everywhere in any universe has ever played.
Yes, but more specifically, like the Icewind Dale books.
Yeah.
Like the Drist, Duerden
kinda.
stories. Just very, like, typical D&D. It's very straightforward in terms of a plot. Yeah, it might sound a little convoluted, but when we were starting off this series, when we were kind of doing the background research on it, when we were kind of starting things off, typically when we do a series, I say to Jeremy, okay, how do we want to break this up? For this case, it was, all right, do you want to do Daggerfall or Arena? And he said Arena, and I'm like, crap, because I knew that I knew that Arena's story was a lot simpler than Daggerfall's. But yeah, it's a very straightforward and probably the easiest to digest story because it is the first foray into the series.
I think it's a great first story because that, like I said, that is literally everyone's first like tabletop RPG experience. Go grab the 5 magic X, Y, and Z's, put them together, and the evil guy dies.
Yeah, basically. And obviously a big point of Page to Pixel here is to break down the themes and inspirations behind these series. And we'll just say it right now, this is just D&D, you know, in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not, like, it's derivative, but in a way that I think is cool and accessible.
Cozy.
It's cozy. It's very cozy.
Like I said, I've played so many of that, it's not even funny.
Yeah, absolutely. Keeping on that theme of D&D, a lot of early PC gaming and early console gaming, you'd have your typical arcade action games, your Pac-Mans, your Mario-style games. But, of course, the hardcore gamers back in the day were the ones that wanted to play D&D-style campaigns. So you have, like, the Wizardry series, if you've ever played any of those or heard of those. Those were some of, like, the earliest, like, computer RPGs that came out in the 80s and 90s. The Ultima series. They actually made a couple, like, D&D specific, like, Pools of Radiance, I remember, was one of the games. So back in, like, the 80s and early 90s, a lot of PC players, at least in the United States, the hardcore players would be more drawn to RPGs, and Bethesda was trying to kind of tap into that market with this new IP, and it was largely successful. I know with Arena and Daggerfall after the releases, because you don't have digital platforms quite yet, they did updates and they did like remastered versions and stuff like that where it kind of ironed out some of the bugs, but I just think about a lot of those really early RPGs on the PC and just how like brutally tough they are to kind of get into. I remember being a kid, and my babysitter had a copy of Pool of Radiance, which was an old school RPG on the NES, and she also had Ultima. And I remember trying to play those, and I'm like 4 or 5 years old, and I am just like, I'm just lost. You know what I mean?
Were those text based, or were those still?
No, they were graphically designed. They had graphic characters and stuff that you could interact with. But
have you ever played a text based? I've never played one. I'm kind of just
I briefly, like, when I go to the Midwest Gaming Classic, they have all those computers set up with like what is it, Zork? I believe it is.
Yeah, that's one of them.
Yeah, I've played them a little bit, but no, it's. Those, I think a lot of the ones I'm talking about are actually have some graphical representation, whether if it's just plain 2D sprites on a static image, or if it's, it really depends on the game. And obviously, as technology got better, so did the game quality. But Arena is just a really good example of this continuing in the early 90s. And I was trying to think, I was actually on a walk today, and I was thinking, like, when did RPGs become more successful? I don't want to take up too much time before we get into Daggerfall here in a second, but that's kind of a question I want to kind of pinpoint to you. When do you think RPGs really began to have more of a popular appeal rather than
are you talking like broad
video? I'm talking specifically video game RPGs. So Western, Japanese, any of that stuff.
I guess my question is, are you talking like mainstream appeal? Because I would say they've always been popular.
I'm talking mainstream appeal, like on the TV appeal.
I mean, just like everything else, PS2 era.
Yeah, I was thinking, I'm looking back on it.
It seems like that's kind of the go-to, is just like that's the era when things it became slightly more okay to be nerdy.
Yeah. Exactly. It's just kind of like it felt like video game RPGs lagged behind pen and paper RPGs in terms of its mainstream popularity by like 10 or so years, because up until 2005, 2010 even, D&D was still considered underground and nerdy, but now it's like everyone loves it, Yeah. And I think RPGs are the same way. I guess looking back at the 90s, sure, there's games like the Final Fantasy series were really popular. Dragon Quest is super popular in Japan, but I think for like mainstream audiences, like in the Western part of the world, thinking like Final Fantasy VII really kind of broke the mold in a lot of ways. But I would say Pokemon. Pokemon, yeah, you might not think of it as an RPG, but it really is. It has all those same characteristics. And look how many copies the Pokemon games have sold over time.
Yeah.
And how it, I probably would not be as interested in some of those other RPGs to come in the future years if it wasn't for Pokemon kind of opening that door in a lot of ways. And I think Final Fantasy, Pokemon, I guess Chrono Trigger, some of those other RPGs in the 90s kind of set the tone. But yeah, like you said, the PS2, PS3 era, when you're getting a lot more Final Fantasies, and other really good, solid RPGs kind of coming through the pipeline. But that's an aside. That's something maybe we can talk about later. But I just thought it was an interesting question to kind of ponder. Are we ready to talk about Daggerfall?
Get at her.
All right. So Daggerfall came out in fall of 1996 for DOS. So Daggerfall, I wrote on my notes here, Daggerfall plot, in parentheses, good luck. So what's interesting compared to Arena is that Daggerfall's plot is kind of jumping into the realm of non-linearity. Daggerfall is set in the Iliac Bay between the provinces of High Rock and Hammerfell. The player is sent there by at the personal request of the Emperor. So you're essentially an agent working for the Emperor. So he wants the player to do two things. First, you must free the ghosts of King Lysandus from his earthly shackles. And he was a king, a human king, that was killed in a battle, but his ghost is still sort of causing torment up in this area. Secondly, the player must discover what happened to a letter from the Emperor to a former queen of Daggerfall. And because there's a lot of political motion going on, when they say the Queen of Daggerfall, that can mean one of many people during the timeline of this game. So this letter, which the Emperor gives to you, and kind of comes off that it's kind of a nonchalant thing, but it actually is the most important piece of this puzzle. The letter reveals that Lysandus' mother, the guy who died and you have to kind of free his soul, that his mother, Nulfaga, knows the location of the Mantella. So the Mantella is the key to resurrecting the first Numidium. So the Numidium is this tool used in previous eras, which is essentially just a giant brass golem. It's like a giant war machine, right? It's a giant, not
thing
a
at
mech.
the end of the first Thor movie.
Right, it's a giant mech suit thing, but it's controlled by this mantella, this magical key. So the Emperor wants his spy force to kind of coerce Nilfgaard into revealing the location of the mantella. So the blades, which I'm sure we'll talk about when we get to Oblivion, which is essentially the personal bodyguard of the Emperor, so that they can kind of find out where the Numidium is and reconstruct it and get it remobilized, right? They want to use it the Emperor wants to use the Numidium for his own goals. But through a series of mishaps and confusions, the letter fell into the hands of an orc named Gottwarg. So not knowing what the mantella is, Gottwarg consults Manimarco, the King of Worms, who is the leader of the Necromancers. During this time, the Underking, who originally destroyed the first Numidium because of its misuse by Tiber Septim a few eras ago, is recuperating deep within the Tomb of High Rock after expending so much energy destroying the Numidium the first time. In order for the player to give the mantella to anyone, the player must kill Lysandius' murderer and put his ghost to rest. That's the first part of the quest. After accomplishing this, the player must steal the totem of Tiber Septim from King Gothrid of Daggerfall and free the mantella from its prison in Aetherius, the spirit realm, right? So following this, the player has 6 options of what to do with the mantella. So here's the different endings that can occur. So if the player gives the mantella to the Underking, we'll talk about him in a second here, he absorbs its power, passes it into eternal rest, and creates a large magic-free area around himself. If Gortwerg, the orc, is victorious, he uses the Numidium to destroy the Imperial forces in the Bay of Kings, where all of these kings are vying for power in the area around Daggerfall. So King Gortwerg destroys all the kings, and after destroying all the kingdoms, the Underking arrives shortly thereafter to destroy the Numidium once and for all. But he does actually lose his life in the process, the Underking does. Gortwerg then succeeds in creating Orsinium, the kingdom of orcs. If the blades are victorious, so if you give the totem and mantella to the Imperial side, if they are victorious, they succeed in recreating the first Numidium and use it to defeat the Bay of Kings and the orcs and unite all of the provinces of Tamriel under the Empire once again. If any of the Bay Kings win, there's quite a few human and elven forces within the Bay. If you give the mantella and the totem to any of them, that king or whoever ruler will use that Numidium to defeat all the other kings just before the Underking destroys him and itself. So, the kings of the Bay will use it, but then the Underking comes, destroys the Numidium, and then destroys himself. If Manimarco, the King of Worms, receives a mantella, he makes himself a god and ascends. Going back to the Underking. So the Underking is one of the options that you can kind of give the mantella for. And his real name is Zurin Arctus. And essentially, he is why the Numidium was created in the first place. He was an ancient magician, ancient powerful person within the Empire who created this. He created the Numidium. And to power it, he used his own soul. He used a part of his soul to power this. So that's one of the reasons why he's trying to make sure it doesn't come back. So that's why in all of these other plot points that the Underking comes back and destroys it, it's because it's him. He's trying to undo all of this chaos, right? So, and what's interesting is all of these plot points, all of these possible endings like I talked about, when looking at the history of the Elder Scrolls, people kind of look back at this event because there's obviously several different options, right? You kind of assume, well, what's the correct ending? Well, because of going to the spirit realm and interacting with outside dimensions, it kind of opens up this time variable where all of these endings happen simultaneously. So the orcs get it, the kings get it, the Underking gets it. So all of the endings I just told you, chronologically, canonically, they all happen at the same time.
Makes sense if you don't think about it.
Yes. So if you're wondering why we're kind of struggling with this stuff, it's because a little bit of it we don't understand ourselves. Looking at the canon of this entire story, all of these events actually do happen. So it's not like, oh, this is the right ending because this is what the plot line. No, all of these actually are the right ending because they all happen to take place because of this space-time continuum issue.
Can I say one thing about the Underking?
Yeah.
So if you look at the cover of Daggerfall, you'll see this
that's him, yeah,
skeletal being, sort of lich-like.
Yep.
And I think it's a really cool sort of artistic take on him because he looks balls-ass evil.
Yep.
But he's actually a good guy.
Yeah, he's just like...
His primary goal is just to die. He just wants to finally be dead. But he will also destroy the Numidium. You know what I mean? Like, it's an interesting sort of dichotomy they play between, like, he looks super evil, but he's actually probably the most benevolent person in this story.
Yeah, because he doesn't have, like, ulterior motives. He's like, yeah, I just want to rest because I saw what this thing did before. Oh, wait, you guys are trying to resurrect it? Don't do that. Like...
No, don't.
No, don't. So I guess it kind of... now that you kind of mention that, now that I think about it, it kind of shows how...
You just can't judge a book by the cover.
Well, yeah, literally. But how power corrupts and all of these petty kingdoms and powers that be are trying to mess with things that they shouldn't. And I think overall, like, the plot is a little bit more compelling than Arena.
Absolutely.
This is like the first game where it feels like, yep, this is Elder Scrolls, 100%.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there also like a hidden faction system where you have to make the people like you in order to even have the option to give them the Mentella?
Yeah, it's kind of like a reputation system, yeah.
But it's like all hidden.
Yeah. This Daggerfall is... I really wish I was my age right now when this came out, because I would be like just balls deep in this, because it's... Yeah, like this is like with Arena, I was watching it, I'm like, oh man, this is a bit cheesy, but when like Daggerfall, like it just felt oddly familiar because it feels so organic.
I plan on finish playing it. Like that's how much I have like enjoyed the little bit I played. Like I do plan to keep playing it.
Like I said, if you guys are ever curious in playing Daggerfall, and I'll send you the same files, Jeremy, for Daggerfall Unity. It's pretty easy to set up, like I said, and it's probably the best way of playing it because it's very... It's still, it's still 1996, but I think with a lot of the things that the amazing modding community has done have really made it a lot more, what's the term, quality of life improvements for sure. But yeah, that's Daggerfall. It has a lot of different branching pathways, so it really does encourage multiple playthroughs, and I think that's so cool about it is you sort of see some of that in the other Elder Scrolls games, especially in Morrowind when you have the different factions and different houses you can join. But with Oblivion and Skyrim, you get more linear choices. Can you really do anything else in Oblivion other than just follow the quest line? Like you can't join the bad guys. In Skyrim, you get the decision to join the Nords or the Imperials, but that's not it. Because you're still going to go fight and kill Alduin, So
I think at the heart of all the Elder Scrolls games, though, is, like even when we get into more in Oblivion, the core storyline is always really, really short. Like if you just do the core story, you can get through it in 4 hours, right? Like
right.
The point of these games is the exploration and the freedom and sort of immersing yourself in these massive worlds. So. Like, I know the Arena and Daggerfall stories seem really short, but there's tons of other quests and exploration to do,
Oh, absolutely.
Like, it doesn't undercut the scope and scale of the accomplishment that was made.
Yeah, 100%. And like we were saying earlier at the beginning of this episode, Daggerfall was the largest game in existence before a procedurally generated space sim came out. So that just kind of tells you how... massive of a
that's
world.
Not fair because the universe is always going to be bigger than a planet.
Right, I totally agree. I'm still going to give Daggerfall its crown, so to speak. So yeah, that really wraps up Daggerfall. How are we feeling so far?
I'm feeling great. I'm feeling like I'm ready to play some Daggerfall.
No, like I said, sometimes with some of this research, it can be a bit more overwhelming than I want it to be. But with this stuff, I'm really like eager to do this. Like. When we sat down to record this one, I was really eager to just kind of talk about this stuff because the series is so cool. And, it gives a lot of...
Context?
Yes, context and substance to some of the stuff. Because, like, you'll interact with, like, the Mages Guild and you'll see, like, some racial stuff happen. But, like, looking at, like, this really, like, helps flesh out Oblivion, I think, really, too. Because, like, the Oblivion Crisis and stuff.
Well, it makes all the games make sense. Yeah. You play through them and, like, you pick up a book here and there that's not the Lusty Argonian made and read a page or two of it.
Yeah.
A lot of time it's just a bunch of like disjointed events, and it's not like you're going to remember and trace these things across all these different games. So having a chance to look at sort of the genesis of the universe, how this arena, so to speak, became to be settled by all the different players in the political game, it puts a lot into perspective, and it makes you appreciate the game even more.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I don't think with the other episodes we're going to necessarily get so in depth with, you know, the origin content. That's really the focus of this episode. Obviously, we're going to talk about the background in depth with the future games. But yeah, this is really setting the tone for the subsequent episodes, and I'm really excited to kind of get into those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would like to dive a little bit into some of that stuff just to add that little bit more context, but I don't think we're going to get to the eyes glazing over stage.
Right, like I was kind of doing with the mythology side of things. Well, if that's everything, I think we can wrap up episode 1 so far.
I think so. Thanks for sticking with us through all that.
Yeah, if you're still listening, we appreciate you. So that being said, we are going to take off for now. The next episode that's going to be coming out after this is going to be more focused on Morrowind and Oblivion. And then we're going to jump into, hopefully, the final episode, which was going to be Skyrim and Elder Scrolls Online.
Are we skipping Battlespire and Redguard?
Yeah, I think we are. That might be if we get some if
we're doing a deep dive, sir.
Okay, maybe we'll do this. Okay, so we will start next episode with a brief. You have 5 minutes to tell me everything about Battlespire and Redguard. And then we're going to jump into Morrowind and Oblivion. We will touch on them, but they are more standalone. They are not like this huge immersive.
No, I watched gameplay of Redguard. I don't want to. Yeah. I don't want to play it.
Yeah, but we have to. We're doing this for the peeps. So, yeah. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you guys coming along, staying with us. I hope you guys enjoy this series as it kind of develops over the course of this summer. So that being said, my name's Reid Jolan. Always, like I said, check us out on Spotify, Instagram, Facebook. We're all over the place. Wherever you get your podcasts, we're always going to be there. So, Jeremy, if you got anything fun to send us out with, do it now.
Stop right there, criminal scum.
That's right. That's perfect. All right, guys. We'll see you later.
See you guys.
And oh my God. Here we go.